My first Feast of Tabernacles was at Branson in 2003. Pam and I had been married for about 7 months, and for about a year, she had shown me so many truths from God's Word that I'd never known. Although I had been educated in a Baptist seminary, I still had one big question. Did it really matter whether we worship God on the first day of the week or on the seventh? Did it really matter? The churches I had attended taught that the Sabbath was changed to Sunday, but I learned that their reasoning was very flawed. Does it really matter to God? Does it really matter? At that feast, I learned that the answer is yes, it does matter to God. In Mark 2:27 to 28, Jesus Christ said, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is also the Lord of the Sabbath." He confirmed the Sabbath command and its purpose, our spiritual and physical benefit, to redirect our minds to our Creator and to rest and worship Him before men in spirit and in truth. So today, I'll go through 5 passages where the Sabbath command is defined 11 times as the seventh day, and then follow the history of how men kept it holy or neglected God's command. The first passage is in Genesis 2, verses 1 through 3, when Jesus Christ created the Sabbath. Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Genesis 2, beginning in verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth and all the hosts of them were finished. And on the seventh day, God ended His work which He had done, and He rested on the seventh day from all His work which He had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it He rested from all His work which God had created and made. Notice 3 times He used the word seventh. He rested on the seventh day, the Sabbath, which He blessed and He set apart as special and different from all the other days, all for a blessing for us. Why do we have a 7-day week? Why do we have a 7-day week? There's no astronomical reason for it. A day is what? 1 revolution of the earth on its axis. A month is 1 revolution of the moon around the earth. A year is 1 revolution of the earth around the sun. But there's no astronomical reason for a 7-day week. No reason for it. God simply created the time period we call a week, ending it by setting the Sabbath as the 7th day. The next day begins a new week by God's command. By God's command. So we have the command when it's created in Genesis 2. And there's no further specific references to the Sabbath or keeping the Sabbath before the Exodus. But let's go to Genesis chapter 26, verse 5. Genesis 26, verse 5. It says, "Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." Very interesting. Now, if you look at Malachi 3:6, Psalm 102:27, and Hebrews 13:8, they all say God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So these laws that's mentioned here include the Sabbath. They include the Sabbath. Abraham would have kept all the laws, including the Sabbath. He would have learned these laws, these commandments, these statutes from righteous men who came before him. Jonathan mentioned Noah and his son Shem. He would have learned from them. He would have also taught them to his descendants, Ishmael and Isaac. And then it would have gone to his other sons as well. Abraham had many other sons. Isaac would have taught them to Esau and Jacob, and so on and so on. Exodus 16. Let's go there next. Exodus 16:23 through 28 is the next mention of the Sabbath. This is when God brought Israel out of Egypt and reminded them of the Sabbath as he provided manna. So let's go to Exodus chapter 16, but let's back up to verse 4. Let's read verses 4 and 5 first. Exodus 16, beginning in verse 4. Exodus 16, verse 4 says, Then the Eternal said to Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them. Very important, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. And it shall be on the 6th day that they shall prepare what they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. Now let's skip down to verse 22, and we see the second passage that defines the Sabbath. Exodus 16, begin at verse 22. And so it was on the 6th day that they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. Then he said to them, This is what the Eternal has said. Tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Eternal. Bake what you will bake today, boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourself all that remains to be kept until morning. So they laid it up till morning as Moses commanded, and it did not stink, nor were there any worms in it. Then Moses said, Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath to the Eternal. Today you will not find any in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will be none. Now it happened that some of the people went out on the Sabbath day, the 7th day, to gather, but they found none. And the Eternal said to Moses, How long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, for the Eternal has given you the Sabbath. Therefore he gives you the 6th day bread for 2 days. Let every man remain in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. So the people rested on the 7th day. Notice how many times the 7th day is equated with the Sabbath. So they were commanded to gather 1 omer for each person for 5 days, and 2 omers on the 6th day. But the Sabbath was special. There wouldn't be any manna. No manna on the Sabbath day. Don't go out and look for it. God tested Israel with the manna and the Sabbath, as we read in verse 4. Do not go out gathering the manna. Do we want God to bless our work? Do we want God to bless our work? God gave them a tangible example of the futility of working on the Sabbath, working against God's will. Do we want to do that? Then beginning in verse 20 of chapter 20, Exodus 20, we see the third passage. The third time when God wrote down His commandments, statutes, and laws, including the Ten Commandments, which included the Sabbath command in verses 8 through 11. So let's go to Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20. And we'll look at verses 8 through 11. Just behave. Exodus chapter 20, beginning in verse 8. It says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the eternal your God. In it you shall do no work. You, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Eternal blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. The seventh day, the seventh day. God's Sabbath commands are for all mankind. None of them were new. They were known by Abraham, by Noah, by Adam. God's laws are meant to be kept universally by the entire world. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 5. In Deuteronomy 5, Moses repeated the commandments. They're in Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5. But this time, he makes no mention of the creation week. He puts more emphasis on the treatments of servants and slaves, especially beginning in the last part of verse 14. So let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 5 and look at verse 14. We'll begin in the middle of that. Deuteronomy 5:14. Starts off, it says, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. And remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. And the Eternal your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Eternal your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So because He's blessed us so greatly, we want to remember that on the Sabbath day. The fourth passage that defines the Sabbath as the seventh day is in Exodus chapter 31, verses 12 through 18. So Moses had been on Mount Sinai and he had gotten the Ten Commandments and all the law. He's still there, but the last thing that he does, or the last thing that God gives him, is God repeats the Sabbath command. And He repeats it apart from the rest of the Ten Commandments. It's like He pulls it out special and He says, this I want you to remember. It's the last thing. He emphasizes that the Sabbath is the sign of His people. The sign of His people. Exodus 31, We'll begin in verse 12. Exodus 31, beginning in verse 12. And the Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, Speak also to the children of Israel, saying, Surely my Sabbaths you shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Eternal, who sanctifies you. You shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. And whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his people. Work shall be done for 6 days, but the seventh is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Eternal. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Twice he says it. Therefore, the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Eternal made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. How many times does he say the seventh day? The Sabbath is the seventh day. And when he had made an end of speaking with him on Mount Sinai, he gave Moses 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone written with the finger of God. How important are God's commandments? The Sabbath is the sign between God and his people. No other nation had that sign. They had similar moral laws, but the Sabbath made Israel stand out as the nation of God. Now, the Jews and the true church of God have always kept God's Sabbath and are known by it. They're known by it. With the Jews, the church has been persecuted down through the ages because of the Sabbath. God's Sabbath is the sign that identifies God's people. To profane it or ignore it is to cut yourself off from being his people. That's pretty blunt. How much more blunt can you get? Now that's back in Exodus. In Exodus 31. But it's repeated again later, much later, in Ezekiel chapter 20. Let's go to Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 11 and 12. God's Sabbaths are again called the sign of God's people. The sign of God's people. Ezekiel chapter 20, beginning in verse 11. And I gave them my statutes and showed them my judgments, which, if a man does, he shall live by them. Moreover, I also gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between them and me, that they might know that I am the Eternal who sanctifies them. So the Sabbath is a sign. It's a sign of who God's people are. He gave that sign to Ezekiel. that sign of the Sabbath, to let them know that God sanctifies them. He set them apart for His own special purpose. He had a purpose for His people. What was that purpose? To be a light to the whole world, displaying the beauty and the wisdom of living God's way. If you look at a map where Israel is, where the land of Israel is, it's right in the middle. Right in the middle of all the big civilizations of the ancient world, between Egypt and Mesopotamia and Greece. God wanted His people to be that light to the world. So the Sabbath is the sign that set Israel apart from the pagan world, set them apart. And it also sets apart God's true church, apart from all the multitudes of religions that have adopted pagan doctrines and pagan practices. The fifth passage. The fifth passage is in Leviticus 23. Leviticus 23 should be very familiar to us. It's when God provided all mankind with an exact, detailed list of His feast days, for everyone to keep. The weekly Sabbath is the first feast mentioned, followed by the annual feasts. So let's go to Leviticus chapter 23. We'll read verses 1 through 4. Leviticus 23, verses 1 through 4. It says, "And the Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, The feast of the Eternal, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, these are my feasts. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of the Eternal in all your dwellings. These are the feasts of the Eternal, holy convocations which you shall proclaim at their appointed times." So which day is the Sabbath? The seventh day. 11 times God says it in 5 different passages. These feasts of the Eternal are holy time, set apart by God, not by Israel, not by Moses, not by any church. God set them apart. And for each of these feasts, not just the Sabbath, but for each of the feasts, God commands us to do 2 things. 2 things. Stop working and gather together to meet with Him. Gather together to meet with Him. That's what God wants on the seventh day. It's a sign. Now, if you look in history, David and Solomon kept God's laws and Sabbaths. They were faithful. But later, God's laws, God's Sabbaths were neglected. People decided they just weren't important anymore. They had other things to do. 3 kings of Judah down through the history. 3 kings led revivals to restore God's laws, to restore the Sabbath, the holy days. Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, and then his great-grandson Josiah, the last righteous king of Judah. But the people soon failed to keep the Sabbath holy. And they slid back into idolatry. They slid back into sin and oppressed the poor. In Jeremiah 17, verses 19 through 27, God confronted Judah and reminded them of the simple Sabbath command. Let's go to Jeremiah chapter 17, verses 19 through 27. Jeremiah 17, beginning in verse 19. Thus the Eternal said to me, Go and stand in the gate of the children of the people, by which the kings of Judah come in and by which they go out, and in all the gates of Jerusalem, and say to them, Hear the word of the Eternal, you kings of Judah and all Judah, and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem who enter by these gates. Thus says the Eternal, Take heed to yourselves and bear no burden on the Sabbath day, nor bring it in by the gates of Jerusalem, nor carry a burden out of your houses on the Sabbath day, nor do any work, but hallow the Sabbath day, as I commanded your fathers. But they did not obey, nor incline their ear, but made their necks stiff, that they might not hear, nor receive instruction. But God continues, And it shall be, if you heed me carefully, says the Eternal, to bring no burden through the gates of this city on the Sabbath day, but hallow the Sabbath day, to do no work in it, then shall enter the gates of this city kings and princes sitting on the throne of David, riding in chariots and on horses, they and their princes, accompanied by the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and this city shall remain forever. And they shall come from the cities of Judah and from the places around Jerusalem, from the land of Benjamin and from the lowland, from the mountains and from the south, bringing burnt offerings and sacrifices, grain offerings and incense, bringing sacrifices of praise to the house of the Eternal. If they would keep the Sabbath day holy. Verse 27. But, there's always a but, if you will not heed me to hallow the Sabbath day, such as not carrying a burden when entering the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, then I will kindle a fire in its gates, and it shall devour the palaces of Jerusalem, and it shall not be quenched. Now, the people of Judah knew God's Sabbath command. They knew it, just like us. But they thought they found a way to get around it. If we ever start looking for ways to get around God's laws, it should throw up a big red flag. Now, they may have rationalized that, well, work was producing something, like a farmer out there plowing or reaping his fields, or a potter making ceramics, or a weaver making a cloth, or making a robe. But buying or selling? Well, it's not really work in that sense. So they may have reasoned that it was allowed on the Sabbath. It's okay. What did God say? Well, God saw it all. They didn't hide anything from God. God saw it all and sent Jeremiah to let them know very clearly that they were wrong. Now, years before this, back in the time of Hezekiah, one of the other kings, Isaiah told them years before not to trample on the Sabbath. Keep your foot from the Sabbath. Don't be working on the Sabbath. Not be doing your own pleasure, doing whatever you want. Doing any work that's related to business, like buying or selling, is breaking God's Sabbath command. Then God gives two if-then statements. Now, how many of y'all know anything about computers and writing a program? There's something called an if-then statement. And it's real simple. You tell the computer, if this equals this, then do this. And if it doesn't equal those things, do something else. If, then, else. It's real simple. So God gives if-then statements. The first one is in verses 24 through 26. God promised that if the people keep the Sabbath holy, then they would be blessed. And if you look at the blessing, it's pretty amazing. It ends with the city of Jerusalem would remain forever, not destroyed. Remain forever. Now, it's interesting though, this passage doesn't say anything about idolatry. It doesn't say anything about oppressing the poor. It doesn't talk about any other sin. In this passage, God's promise is based only on keeping the Sabbath holy. Does that strike you as odd? All you have to do is keep the Sabbath holy. The point is, how we keep the Sabbath is a good indicator of how seriously we approach all of God's law. Now let me say that again. How we keep the Sabbath is a good indicator of how seriously we approach all of God's law. The first if-then statement is, if we keep the Sabbath as a weekly reminder of God's ways, of using that time to develop a strong relationship with God, drawing closer to Him, then it will help us remain faithful and avoid all those other kinds of sin. Our faithfulness and God's blessings depend on keeping the Sabbath holy. Keeping God's word, keeping God's commands, keeping God's blessings right in front of us, week after week after week. If you don't do that, what happens? Well, you fall into the second if-then statement in verse 27. If they fail to keep the Sabbath holy, then they would face a fire that would destroy them completely. If they failed, they faced a fire that would destroy them. What did they do? They ignored God's warnings from Jeremiah. They had free will. They could do what they want, and they did. They ignored it. But soon, Jerusalem, all its palaces, and the temple itself were destroyed. And all its people were taken captive to Babylon for 70 years. It's a sad end to the kingdom of Judah. Only a few of them were left, and their job was to till the land for their enemies. But then God sent Cyrus. Now, Cyrus was a Persian king. They defeated the Babylonians and allowed them to return to Jerusalem. But even after they returned to Jerusalem, they still failed to keep the law of God, including the Sabbath. Let's go to Nehemiah chapter 10. Nehemiah chapter 10. Nehemiah was cupbearer for the king, for King Cyrus, and he came in to help rebuild the walls. He saw what was going on, talked to the people, and he gathered them together to make an oath to God. Nehemiah chapter 10, we'll read verses 28 through 31. Nehemiah 10, beginning in verse 28. Now the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the Nephilim, and all those who had separated themselves from the peoples of the lands to the law of God, their wives, their sons, their daughters, everyone who had knowledge and understanding, these joined with their brethren, their nobles, and entered into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law, which was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and do all the commandments of the eternal our God, and his ordinances and his statutes. We would not give our daughters as wives to the people of the land, nor take their daughters for our sons. If the peoples of the land brought wares or any grain to sell on the Sabbath day, we would not buy it from them on the Sabbath or on a holy day. And we would forego the 7th year's produce and the exacting of every debt. Quite an oath. Quite an oath. They recognized just how important the Sabbath was to maintaining their relationship with God. But what happened? They soon forgot the oath. They forgot it. 3 chapters later in Nehemiah chapter 13, let's turn there. Nehemiah had to take more action. He had to prevent people from breaking the Sabbath. Well, at least in Jerusalem. Couldn't control everybody, but at least in Jerusalem. Nehemiah chapter 13. Let's read from 15 to 22. Nehemiah 13, verses 15 to 22. Now remember, they'd just given this oath 3 chapters earlier. Nehemiah 13, beginning in verse 15. In those days I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in sheaves, and loading donkeys with wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them about the day on which they were selling provisions. Men of Tyre dwelt there also, who brought in fish and all kinds of goods, and sold them on the Sabbath to the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. Then I contended with the nobles of Judah and said to them, what evil thing is this that you do, by which you profane the Sabbath day Did not your fathers do thus? And did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Yet you bring added wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. So it was at the gates of Jerusalem, as it began to be dark before the Sabbath, that I commanded the gates to be shut, and charged that they must not be opened till after the Sabbath. Then I posted some of my servants at the gates, so that no burdens would be brought in on the Sabbath day. Now, the merchants and the sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice. They were going to sell out there. Then I warned them and said to them, why do you spend the night around the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. From that time on, they came no more on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves, and that they should go and guard the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. Remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of your mercy. Nehemiah got it. He understood just how important the Sabbath day was. Now, this happened in the 5th century BC. The 5th century, the 400s BC. And a great awakening took place among the Jewish community with respect to the importance of God's law. They began to see how important it was. At this time, it said that two signs sort of identified Judaism. One was circumcision, and the other was the Sabbath. Circumcision and the Sabbath. People knew them by those two things. But time went on. By the 2nd century BC, the 100s, Persia had been overthrown by Alexander the Great. The descendants of his generals ruled Judea, and they tried to Hellenize the people, make them into Greeks, to Hellenize them. And those people were persecuted for keeping God's laws, including the Sabbath. Now, the Pharisees became Jewish leaders during this time, the time of the Maccabean revolt against these rulers. This is from 167 to 160 BC. Now, the Pharisees added lists of regulations to build a wall around God's laws to make it impossible for anyone to break the Sabbath, forcing people to obey God, that it made the Sabbath day a burden. They even misused Jeremiah 17 to teach that no burden could be carried on the Sabbath. They condemned Jesus. Actually the man that Jesus healed. Jesus had healed a man and told him to carry his pallet, pick up your bed, and go home. And they condemned the man. The Sabbath rules they added included all sorts of things. Preparing food, taking anything between houses, drawing water, riding on an animal or in a ship, making war, sexual relations, walking more than 1,000 steps, treating a sickness unless the person's life was in immediate danger. They even classified picking a few ears of grain as reaping. And if you rub those grains between your hands to rub the husk off, well, that was threshing. And when Jesus and his disciples did this and ate a few grains of ears of grain, Jesus didn't defend his actions by saying, well, the Sabbath was done away. He didn't do that. What he did was he rejected their additional laws, these laws that were added by the Pharisees. That was the problem. Jesus Christ never spoke against the Sabbath command, not once. He clarified the spirit of the law, and he stressed the importance of individual responsibility for personal and public worship on the Sabbath. Jesus Christ was clearly a Sabbath keeper, not a Sabbath breaker. Let's go to Luke chapter 4, verses 15 and 16. This said what Jesus did. Luke 4, beginning in verse 15. It says, "And he taught in their synagogues, being glorified by all. So he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read." That was his custom. That's what he did. He always commanded his followers to be Sabbath keepers, even to the last days. How do we know that? Well, if he hadn't, otherwise he would never said in Matthew 24:20, he said, "And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath." In winter or on the Sabbath. Now, it wouldn't have mattered to them if it was on the Sabbath if they weren't keeping the Sabbath. Now, some people have said, well, he was just talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. But even if that's the case, even if that's what he was talking about, it would still prove that long after the church was established, they were still keeping the Sabbath day. Let's go to Acts chapter 6. Acts chapter 6, verse 7. One verse. Acts 6, verse 7. Acts 6, verse 7 says, "Then the word of God spread, and the number of the disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of the priests were obedient to the faith." Think about that for a minute. The priests joined the church. The priests would never have agreed to break the Sabbath. They had taught it for centuries. They would never have agreed to that. Even the Jews in Palestine and in Jerusalem who attacked Paul later on, they never accused him of breaking the Sabbath. Never accused him of it, because he didn't. The disciples met and taught in synagogues on the Sabbath in Gentile cities all over the Roman Empire. Let's go to Acts chapter 13, verses 42 to 44. Now, this records the reaction of Gentiles. This is a Gentile city in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. The reaction of Gentiles when Paul spoke at Antioch in Pisidia. Acts chapter 13, verses 42 to 44. "So when the Jews went out of the synagogue, the Gentiles begged that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. Now, when the congregation had broken up, many of the Jews and devout proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, who, speaking to them, persuaded them to continue in the grace of God. On the next Sabbath, almost the whole city came together to hear the word of God. Now, if Paul thought that the first day of the week was for worship, for rest, and for teaching, he could easily have said, "Come back tomorrow. We'll continue this tomorrow." But he didn't. He did not do that. They waited a whole week. And then Paul preached to that whole Gentile city on the Sabbath day. Meeting on the Sabbath was completely normal for Gentile converts. Notice that Luke called it the Sabbath. He didn't call it the Jewish Sabbath. It was normal. People knew what the Sabbath was. Now, there's a Greek word that refers to the seventh day of the week. It was hebdomos. Hebdomos. Now, there's also a Latin word, it's dies septimus. He could have used either of those, but he didn't. Luke called it the Sabbath. And he indicated that this was God's holy day of rest. They knew exactly what he was talking about. Let's go a few more chapters over to Acts chapter 15. Acts 15 and verse 5. Now, you may know that Acts 15 is the Jerusalem Conference. That's what it's called. And this happened about 49 AD. Christians who had been Pharisees before they were converted said that for a person to become a Christian, and this is in verse 5, it is necessary to circumcise them and to command them to keep the law of Moses. Now, what these Pharisees called the law of Moses, that was their long list of rules, regulations about the Sabbath, in addition to God's law. So they had a big discussion, the Jerusalem Conference. And Jesus Christ led the apostles and the elders to declare one after the other how uncircumcised Gentiles had been called, had turned to God, and had received the Spirit of God. And he led them to understand that circumcision and keeping the Pharisees' regulations was not necessary. Now, James, this was Christ's brother, was an apostle. James summarized their understanding of Christ's guidance in this conference in Acts 15:21. This is what he said. He said, "For Moses has had throughout many generations those who preach him in every city, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath." So in cities all through the Roman Empire, on the Sabbath, Moses was being read. They knew the law. They knew what the Sabbath was. Wasn't any question about it. And it's interesting too, what was their source of authority? What did they go by? The written word of God. It was read to them every Sabbath. And the Gentile Christians, they accepted and they obeyed God's law, even in this world full of idolatry and immorality, where men ate blood and ate things strangled. And of course, they were reminded not to do those things because it was all around them. They had to avoid those things. But they had God's law and they knew what they should do. Nowhere in that conference, this was a big conference, all the apostles and elders were there. Nowhere in that conference was keeping the Sabbath addressed. They didn't talk about whether you should keep the Sabbath. And that's a clear indication that keeping the Sabbath was not an issue. It was not a controversy. They all agreed on that. Gentile Christians living outside Judea knew that God commanded them to keep the Sabbath on the seventh day of every week. At that time, no Christians were teaching that the Sabbath was not to be observed and not kept holy. No Christians. Not one. Let's go to Acts chapter 21. Acts 21, verse 20. I won't read the whole thing, but Acts 21, verse 20, this is Paul's last visit to Jerusalem. This is about 58 to 60 AD. And it says that myriads of the Jews, these are converted Jews, these are Christians, myriads of Jews were all zealous of the law. All zealous of the law. Now that's God's law. It's not the Pharisees' law, that's God's law. And it certainly included keeping the Sabbath. Those Jewish Christians were keeping the Sabbath. And what did Paul do? He proved that he was just as zealous for God's law. Now, if Jesus or his disciples or his apostles had taught or practiced the nullification of the Sabbath command, that it didn't matter anymore, if they had taught that, it would have been a major controversy. It would have been a big fight. But throughout the New Testament period, throughout all of the New Testament, keeping the Sabbath was never challenged. Never challenged. It wasn't questioned. There's no controversy in the church over keeping the Sabbath. The Sabbath was assumed to be God's will. It was kept by Christ. It was kept by the early Christians, including the Gentiles. The only issue was how to rightly keep the Sabbath command, because the Pharisees were adding on to it. Now, in the 1880s, there was a Catholic cardinal, Cardinal Gibbons, and he admitted in the 1880s in his book, The Faith of Our Fathers, 92nd edition, page 89, he said, "You may read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and you will not find a single line authorizing the sanctification of Sunday. The Scriptures enforce the religious observance of," he says, Saturday. We know that's the Sabbath. "A day which we," meaning the Catholic Church, "never sanctify." Interesting to admit that. Now, during the time from 100 BC all the way to 100 AD, Roman writers said that many people were careful on the Sabbath day to avoid offending the Jews. These are Romans. They were keeping the Sabbath to the point where they didn't offend the Jews. Now, these writers, you may recognize some of these names: Horace, Ovid, Tibullus, Seneca, Juvenal. Very famous Roman writers. They all said that. Historian Samuel Dill, in his book Roman Society from Nero to Marcus Aurelius, said, an observance of the Sabbath became a very common sight in some quarters of Rome. So this was a common thing. People all over were keeping the Sabbath to some degree. They were very familiar with it. They knew what it was. So how did all this change? How did it change? Well, it changed beginning in AD 70. The hatred and the persecution of the Jews by the Romans began after the first Jewish revolt. The Jews revolted against Rome, and in AD 70, anybody remember what happened in AD 70? Jerusalem is destroyed. The temple is destroyed. Historian Samuel Bakioki said that many Christians, even then, continued to attend Jewish synagogues until about 80 to 90 AD, when rabbinical authorities introduced a curse in the daily prayer to detect the presence of Christians in the synagogue. So the Jewish authorities wanted to kick them out. Then after the second Jewish revolt, this was in 135 AD, hatred and persecution of the Jews by the Romans intensified. And after that, many Christians abandoned God's laws to avoid persecution with the Jews. Sunday worship was adopted to eliminate suspicion. Then the Universal Church of Rome, controlled by the emperor, claimed the divine right to change the day of worship to Sunday, just like the pagan religions, those that worship the sun god. And later councils outlawed keeping the Sabbath. But even then, many Catholics continued keeping the Sabbath alongside Sunday worship. One Catholic theologian, Gregory of Nyssa, wrote in 394 AD, with what face will you dare to behold the Lord's Day, which is Sunday, what they called Sunday, if you will despise the Sabbath, for they are sister days? They wanted to do both. The apostolic constitutions from around 375 AD exhort the faithful to assemble on the Sabbath day and the Lord's Day. Both days are feasts. The Sabbath is to be celebrated as a memorial of creation and a time for godliness. Even as late as 440 AD, the Catholic historian Sozomen said, the people of Constantinople and almost everywhere assemble together on the Sabbath as well as on the first day of the week, which custom is never observed at Rome or at Alexandria. The Sabbath, instituted at creation, written by the finger of God at Sinai, upheld by Jesus and his disciples, is the covenant sign of God's people. And it is a test command. A test command. If we neglect the Sabbath, what does it do? It leads to individual and national, spiritual and physical decline, as we saw in the biblical history. But if we remember to keep the Sabbath holy, God will greatly bless us, which we'll explore in my next message.